Data nerd. I will not feel ashamed anymore because it's data for liberation of our people. So thank you for everyone who was here today, earlier this morning. And we're going to get started. There are a few things that I need to tell you, which are pretty much that there's cobbler back there and water and coffee. And as we get ready to start this afternoon's first session, the sea change in racial politics and in the electoral arena, 2008 to 2020, movements and elections. I am, in addition to being a researcher, closet researcher, I'm a philanthropy executive now, so closet researcher. I'm also a closet political scientist, so this is like, I've been waiting for this panel all day. And so I want to just introduce the moderator for the panel, and then she'll introduce the rest of our panelists today, and we'll get started. So the moderator, Regina Freer, Dr. Regina Freer, her mom would be happy if I remember to say Dr. Freer, is a longtime friend and advocate, and this is homecoming to me in so many ways. All the panelists have been really incredible, and they are people that I know and I'm happy to see. Regina is one of those people, too, Dr. Regina Freer. She's a professor of politics, Black studies, urban and environmental policy at Occidental College. She is also on the board of the Los Angeles Black Workers Center, and she's done many other community leading roles, and we're just really happy to have her here. I also want to plug her book, which is The Next Los Angeles, Struggle for a Livable City. And these are all ways in which you can see research in action. So I want to turn it over at this point to Regina. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to help to facilitate a conversation amongst folks who I know have a lot to teach and tell us about the work that they're doing and how movements and electoral politics engage with one another. And so much of the time, folks who are doing movement work find ourselves asking questions about whether elections matter and how do they matter and what should we be doing in conjunction with elections, and should we be doing anything in conjunction with elections. And that's a theme that's been kind of cycling through, and so I'm really excited to hear what folks who are engaging in various ways with the electoral system and with movement have to say about that relationship and the promise and perils, I guess, of that relationship. And so I will. Their names are here, but I'm going to say their names and the organizations that they're affiliated with, but also have a series of questions for them, and so I will ask those questions and we'll have conversation, and I want you all to please feel free to rephrase and reframe questions that you think could be better answered. I'm happy to have that happen, and then we'll turn to the audience as well. So to my immediate right, only in geography, I don't think that's about politics.
Shots fired from the beginning.
No, because we're all on the list. Right. That's right. Mo Mitchell from the Working Families Party, Jessica Byrd from 3 Points Strategy, and Judith Browne Dianis from the Advancement Project. And they are all more than an addition to all of that, and so we'll hear more about that hopefully. So just to give a broad sweep of some of the questions that I'm hoping that the panelists can talk through, is about their work, about kind of the inside-outside game, and how we play it, and how perhaps we don't play it as effectively as we could. What do we know about how Black folks are approaching this election, and how does history inform that? What about moving beyond kind of to down ballot races, to local elections, to congressional races, to ballot initiatives, and also thinking about like straight up stolen elections, and how we kind of confront that reality and voter suppression. What about alternatives, and what does it take for us to push back against a narrative, for example, that third parties or even thinking or talking about that is nothing but divisive and is going to keep us further from our goal? Is there something we need to be thinking about structurally in that regard? So those are kind of a broad sweep. I'm going to ask them in more detail and more specificity as we go, but maybe if we could start, and we can just go down the line. If you can tell us about the work that you're doing and how that work kind of frames and shapes your perceptions of this political moment. And I'm thinking particularly about the time from Obama's election to now, and how things have shifted for you and your work, particularly engaging with the electoral arena.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Scholars for Social Justice, and all of you beautiful Black people, as well as the other beautiful people who are non-Black. But especially the beautiful Black people. Again, I'm Maurice Mitchell. I'm the National Director of the Working Families Party. So the way that
Yeah, you are.
Yes, it is. And I completed my 1 year in August 1st. Really excited. Thank you. That 1 year was 120 trips, which was great because I got a chance to, in a very rigorous way, have a lot of conversations with a lot of Americans, and I think I have something, I probably had enough data points where I could have done some of that data work that you all talked about last panel if I had a fore conversation to correctly take that data in. But so looking at in 2008, I was working on an election in Long Island on a state senate race, and when we got the news. So I wasn't working on the Obama race, I was working on the state senate race. But when we got the news, I was standing on a table and I was, I think I had a shirt on and I was doing this helicopter move. It was very exciting. There was this exuberance that I don't think anybody had ever felt for an election, especially everyday Black people. I remember the day afterwards and the week afterwards, if I encountered any Black person, we just had this strange, this happened more than once where I encountered a Black person, it's we did it, right? And so what I think is interesting about 2008 to now is that I feel like we as a culture have matured politically in many ways, and I feel like some contradictions and some debates have been settled in some ways, right? So there's been this perennial debate, especially in the movement left, and one that I personally have solved about whether or not electoral strategies even matter, and whether or not it makes sense for Black folks to be involved in elections or not. And there's a lot of these very big picture theoretical conversations around the United States project is a white settler colonial project, and so doing anything that advances any of its systems is some way advancing white colonial settler okay, great, cool. Now I think what was good about the 2016 election is that it settled for a lot of people whether or not elections have consequences and whether or not presidential politics have serious material consequences on everyday people's lives, right? And so I engage in very, very different conversations with folks around elections that were, more of a debate, right? And the other thing that I feel like the Obama election settled was the value of liberal diversity, right? So we had a Black president, right? And so to me, having a Black president is the pinnacle of achievement for liberal diversity. Our ability to mix things up and have a rainbow of people doing different things, right? And liberal diversity in no way advances the actual objective of challenging white supremacy, right? Simply having Black people in certain roles. I mean, we have a Black Supreme Court justice, right? It's identity itself is insufficient. And I feel like that is not a theoretical concept for people. Everyday people understand why, concretely, why identity itself, simply getting Black people elected is insufficient. And in fact, Black people can be Trojan horses for all types of anti-Black political strategies, right? Including, and the most egregious is Clarence Thomas, but I'm also talking about Black Democrats, right? And there's plenty of Black elected officials who are some of the most corporate people on the planet, right? Who have completely given up on even like having any patina of connection to their base and to their community, right? But they're able to signify in this way, right? They're able to draw on the legacy of Black left traditions and use all of this stuff, and they're able to like code switch, right? They're able to go to the fish fry and do all these things that aren't substantive policies, right? In order to signify that they're about something. And I think all of that is being laid bare. And, like if you look at, there's Black people who are running right now for president, right? And they are having to work in order to get Black people to align with them, right? And that to me is a good thing. It suggests that the Black electorate as a whole has matured through this experience. Like our innocence around us being able to shroud ourselves in liberal diversity, right? Like that is gone, right? And we're in this Trump era where, I'll say more about this, but we're in this Trump era where a lot of the realities have been laid bare, and a lot of the conversations that have been sort of niche conversations, theoretical conversations, academic conversations, are now popular conversations. Because what has always been true about the sort of sausage making of American politics is now laid bare. So the Republicans have always used white supremacy as a tactic, but they use dog whistles, right? And now the Trump strategy is like, no dog whistle. We are going to use white supremacy as an explicit tactic, right? And so now we're able to have this conversation. Like I remember when I was coming up, most of the people that were using white supremacy in their day-to-day conversation were like little random niche lefty people, right, that were not taken seriously in mainstream conversation. We're able to talk about white supremacy in mainstream conversations, right? So one of the advantages, and there's a lot of disadvantages of the Trump era, one of the advantages of the Trump era, I think, is it's a moment of just very, very clear, very almost binary, moral, ethical, political, and ideological clarity. So as an organizer, this is a moment, a rare moment, if we choose it, and if we as a left and as a Black left, and we as folks who are on the other side of the binary, are able to operate like we're in different political conditions, then we could take advantage of this in order to move the ball. The problem is, most people, and this is true of all of the Democratic Party functionaries, aren't operating like we're under different political conditions. This is like a 5-alarm fire. We are under different political conditions. And their lack of assessment, their inability to reassess these political conditions, and there's a lot of reasons for it. One of the reasons is there's so many reasons, but one of the reasons is that, and please cut me off, is that, help me land the plane, tell me when I have like 30 seconds, is that, landing right now, is that landing, one thing I'll say is that, one way of looking at our politics is like, it's a multi-billion-dollar marketplace, right? And that marketplace, like all marketplaces, are in some ways like ideologically neutral, right? And Democratic and Republican Party politics are similar. The people who are driving that market are the consulting class, right? None of them, most of them don't look like us. The folks who are literally, like there's one firm that makes more than $100 million a cycle just placing TV ads. They will be good no matter what circumstance, as long as they could create the conditions where they could continue to get people to spend that much money on TV, they're good. And those are the people. Those are the people. Not our high-minded ideas about what's right and wrong. Those are the people, and those market forces are what drive the agenda of the Democratic Party. The role of the DCCC, the DLC, the DGA is to raise and spend money to get Democrats elected, not for the liberation of anybody. And until we figure out how to solve that, we will be in Trump situation part 2, 2020.
Hey everyone.
Hey.
You got us warmed up. My name is Jessica Byrd. Thank you for having me. So I lead 3 Point Strategies, which is lovingly called the electoral firm of the movement.
Yes.
I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, and I've been working on campaigns since I was 16 after getting addicted because my mom was a poll worker, and so I used to sit on her lap while she would register voters and she would do my hair. And I realized at a young age that I was pretty damn good at elections, that I could figure out the formula, and that I actually really liked talking to people. And so I followed that path for a really long time. And I would say I spent nearly 10 years kind of being groomed in some of these democratic systems. I grew up in Ohio. It's a nearly $1 billion political economy. There are a lot of not only resources and trainings led by Democrats, but after 10 years, I had worked on over 100 campaigns in 43 states. I landed at Emily's List, where I was tasked with building the first women of color candidate recruitment program. And I kind of thought I made it. I was like a formerly poor black girl. I had been chasing a dream of campaigns. Donna Brazile was like the only black woman campaign manager that I knew. And I remember putting her picture on my dorm room wall, thinking like, eventually I will manage a presidential campaign. And although I was a Black Studies and poli-sci major, I've always seen my politics as racialized and deeply gendered. I really did not yet understand the way that systems were functioning inside of the work that I was doing. And because of just the deeply entrenched way that the two-party system really exists, which Mo started to talk about, and I think that we'll get into, I was inside of that. And even though I was trying to push, I actually didn't necessarily know how else to utilize this skill. And then August 9th, 2014 happened. And I was sitting at my desk in this so-called dream job, and I was scrolling through as Michael Browne's body was laying in the street in Ferguson, Missouri. And I went through for myself personally a deeply existential and moral crisis around this skill that I had been learning and I thought I was pretty good at. And although I had been showing up in movement, so at the time I was a member of BYP 100 DC, I was risking arrest in my personal life, I was walking in the doors of a $100 million PAC, and I wasn't actually thinking or allowed to think pretty explicitly about movement. And so 3 Point Strategies was a question. I left Emily's List 6 months later after blowing up nearly every meeting that I was in for that 6 months. Working it out, I was working it out. And I created 3 Point Strategies essentially as a question. I had already been working to elect Black women, and my question was, could I elect the baddest, boldest, most radical Black woman? I had a question about whether or not the meetings that I was in movement, where we could also think about utilizing electoral strategy as a tactic, and whether I had a place in contributing most meaningfully with this thing that I knew how to do. And then I also had a big question for the system, how I, as a practitioner of elections, could unlearn the shit that I learned, but also whether or not there was a meaningful question. So that was nearly 5 years ago, and I'm really proud to say that Stacey Abrams was my second client ever, and I most recently served as her deputy campaign manager. And so we built that campaign together over 3 years, pretty quietly, and then not quietly. I also co-lead the Electoral Justice Project of the Movement for Black Lives with Taylor Reid and Rakia Lumumba, who I will invoke later, on all the incredible work that they're doing. And honestly, I also feel like, and I have to say this too in all of these questions, is I actually feel like Mo is a part of some of the answers that I've been asking. Whether or not a really meaningful, not just third party, because I actually think it's bullshit that we do the leg thing, but actually a really meaningful political infrastructure and organization could be built with a person who has not only radical ideas, but a base across the country. And so I feel like this year in particular, I've been experimenting with systems. And not only experimenting with systems, but I feel like even some of the folks in this room who I admire so much, like Adrian Shropshire, I feel like there's a calling towards deepening the Black political ecosystem. So the unfinished business, to your question, I think, is that movement got us here. We know that. So many folks stepped out on movement faith over the last 5 years really bravely. And now we gotta deepen. There's this feeling that I'm feeling currently that because of how loud the resistance has gotten, because of how noisy it feels around movement politics, that there's this idea that we're no longer necessarily leading it because we're not in some of the $100 million rooms that we know that white-led progressive orgs are in. But I actually believe that we are. And Trump actually was responding directly to movement. And so I think we have to respond back in our leadership. And for me, what that means is continuing to answer these questions that I know I started, so many of us started 5 years ago and before that. But by responding with a way deepening of our work together collectively, a way deepening of the start of a Black political infrastructure, so that actually not only when we win in November, which I think we can do, but that we get to govern and then continue to deepen when everyone else goes away. So I'll leave it there for now.
Hello. Hi, I'm Judith Browne Dianis again, and I'm Executive Director of the National Office of Advancement Project. And I want to thank Kathy and Barbara and Jocelyn for bringing me here today. I've been here all week because we do an event here every year at Advancement Project, so I'm just looking out saying the beach is there. So it's been a wonderful week. So just also really excited about being in this discussion because you know, I'm the Yelder of the movement space, and so I'm always honored when I get to be around the youngers because they're just incredible, right? And so Jessica and Mo in particular, they're just doing work like on a whole nother level. I'm so proud of what they have been doing. So I come to this. No, really, I love y'all. I come to this as a lawyer. We started Advancement Project because we kind of realized that the revolution will not be litigated. That I was at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund where I learned a lot. It was incredible. But really what we wanted to do was that we knew that, you know, the courts were moving to the right, we were losing our cases, and that we had to get back to building power. And that power was going to get rid of structural racism. That was our quick answer to things. And so we started this organization with the idea that we were going to work with grassroots organizations, we were going to support movement building, we were going to bring legal to it, but we were also going to do communications work because we knew not only did we have to build political will within our communities, but also outside of our communities. And the 2000 election happened, and we were like, oh, wait a second. We didn't start out to be a voting rights organization or to do voting rights work, but the 2000 election brought us into it because we had to figure out what the hell happened in Florida. And so our work has always been around this power equation, but also how voting also boosts that, right? But not that elections are not all of it, right? For us, it is the 365 of civic participation, which is not just on election day, but it's what are you doing in all the days in between to hold folks accountable. And so that's the work we do. Thinking about the trajectory of 2008 to now, I think, Mo, I want to second this the way in which the conversation has changed dramatically. I remember even like having a board meeting years ago when we first started, and one of my board members saying they didn't like, the fact that people would say the word racist, right? And it was a white board member. And to now, like, white supremacy just being like always in the news. And that's not necessarily good because it depends on, how we're actually defining white supremacy, right? Because there's ways in which those kinds of terms can be used, overused, and actually watered down in ways that for us who live with it and are impacted by it are saying, actually, that's not what it is, right? So, but it is good. Reparations, right? Like, all the folks who've been doing work around reparations for forever, and now it is becoming part of our conversation and our discourse. And I think we really have to, in like thinking about where we are, yes, Trump, right? But the movement for Black Lives, has changed the trajectory and the conversation around race generally, and around Black people and what we want, and has pushed our stuff left, right? And so left. And that's real. I think that's very important. I think it's going to be important in this election cycle that we are going to be able to have conversations that we haven't been able to have, that our people are waking up to the mandate by Mary Hooks, and and having to what Dream Defenders did after Trayvon was killed and take over Florida. There's just a different world out there for Black folks and the kinds of conversations, but the way in which people are engaging with it is very different. And then also seeing the candidates that are very different. At the same time, from where I sit, on the voter suppression side, it's still bad, right? And we saw after Obama that 2008, we had voter suppression clearly 2000 and 2008, 2004, we sued the RNC over voter caging. 2008, we decided we were going to sue Virginia because they didn't, racial disparities in the allocation of polling places. And 2011, after he got elected, that's when it hit hard. And the Republicans went all out. And so we're still fighting it. And for the work that we do, it's a different story every election cycle. And I always have to sit back and think about, well, if I were going to steal an election, what would be the tool that I would use this time around? And I'm never able to do it because I'm not a thief like that, right? But it's clear that they always have a different thing that they're using because they understand the power of our vote. And, we've just got to keep staying ahead. So I'm going to stop there so we can get into the conversation.
Thank you all. To take your lead deep in a bit on some of the work that you and your organizations have been doing relative to the electoral arena. And so Mo, you have a quote that Barbara Ransby invoked in her recent New York Times op-ed. This political moment has radicalized liberals and electoralized radicals.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk more about what that means on the ground with the Working Families Party.
Okay.
Thank you. And a highlight of my life up until this point. And I turned 40 July 25th.
Yeah.
Yes, was being quoted like Dr. Barbara Ransby in the New York Times. So one way I could describe it is just yesterday, I gave the keynote to Indivisible's conference, and today I'm here. And I don't have different pitches for different audiences. And, the mainly white, mainly sort of middle-aged white women, not only, it's a diverse group of people that were in the crowd in Indivisible, resonated and immediately understood why white supremacy was our most clear and present existential threat for global survival as a human species, right? we're in different political times. That same cohort of people, if I had that same conversation with them only a few years ago, would not have immediately understood that, right? And so the Trump election, I think, laid bare and resolved some fundamental questions. Like I said before, like I've had this debate for years with very, very thoughtful people who have a really sharp analysis and theoretical analysis on whether or not electoral politics matter, whether or not electoral strategies are strategies that we should invest in the in the diverse strategies that we have in our strategic toolkit, right? I don't have that conversation as much with some of the same people, right? Or almost at all, right? I have a unique, I don't really talk about my experience, like I have a unique sort of trajectory where I've, over years, over decades, I've built very, very deep relationships and have struggled with folks engaged in the Black liberation struggle, as well as people who have been functionaries in the sort of like nonprofit industrial complex, and folks who have been sort of the political hacks of the Democratic Party machinery, right? And so I have this sort of strange sort of connection with all of these people. I'm having the same conversations with all of these people, right? And there's like large organizations that are DC-based organizations that are seriously talking about, are scenario planning around, wait, what happens when the very likely scenario that Trump loses, but he doesn't concede? Right? What happens then? And it like the natural conclusion, the natural conclusion is that the tactics that we would have to use are tactics that they are not practicing. But they're getting to the point where like, all right, well we need to figure that out, right? Like places like CAP, for example. There's people in that building that are wrestling Center for American Progress, right? The most neoliberal, big Democratic Party, right? They're like, what do we do? There's a dry erase board in CAP where they're like, question marks, what do we do? Revolution, how? Right?
And there are 400 of them, so there are a lot of
yes, the point I'm making is this is a very rare opportunity for our leadership, because these are questions that we have been thinking about and working on and have some practice in, both theoretically and practically. And in a moment, one of the blessings of the Clinton loss is that the unearned sort of confidence of the Democratic hierarchy was completely shot, and they've been rudderless strategically. And so it's a moment, listen, like in nature does not like vacuums. There's a vacuum of strategic leadership right now. Folks on the left could actually take that if we're organized and we're clear enough. This moment is both an invitation and a challenge for us. If we actually believe in our politics, and we believe that our politics are majoritarian and a path to victory, it's now, while that strategic window is open, for us to engage, which means we're gonna have to collaborate with many of those neoliberals and many of those folks that we've never collaborated before, right, with before. And to me, like, what I want to challenge folks who have been on the left for a while is like, do you believe that we can and should win, right? Do you believe that we can and should take power, right? The right is clear about that, including the niche right. They're trying to take state power. White supremacists have taken control of the federal government. And that lack of clarity with us, but that clarity around the right, we need to get clear. And all of our strategies should be strategies around taking power. That is one of the advantages that the right has. They are single-mindedly focused on power and building the structures. They don't care about elections, right? Like, elections are pathways to power. But they're not obsessive about 2020. They're obsessive about their radical niche vision, which they are executing with mastery, by the way. And they're on step 4 or 5 to like completing this masterwork that they've been working on for 4 decades, right? Meanwhile, folks with those dry erase boards in DC are like, how are we going to win this election? They are like, how are we going to transform this world and beckon it towards our image? How are we going to commandeer this democracy and commandeer this world economy so that we're not just winning, we're in full and complete domination? That's what they think about and strategize about. Meanwhile, there are Democrats trying to figure out, like, how does Biden get elected 2020, right? And so they will never not be them, right? I've done this also. I've done this in many spaces. How many people raise your hand if you think that Nancy's going to lead us to victory? Or Chuck Schumer's going to lead us to victory? In all different rooms, not nary a hand raised, right? And to me, that's a challenge to us. It means that the Democratic Party is vacuous when it comes to the strategy. The actual people, the actual left, the actual movement, it's here. But we need to actually believe we can win, and we need to form the strategy, create the alignment in order to, you know, we do it every, like, we drag this country, you know, from oblivion. You know, we have to do it because we're on this boat, right? To me, I'm very clear, right? We're on the boat. Yes, everybody else is on the boat with us. Like, it's our duty for our children, for our great-grandchildren, everybody else, for us to do it again in this moment. But another thing, we have to figure out the proximal answer as well as the long-term play, and that's why I'm building a party, right? So that we don't de facto have all of our gains end up advantaging the Democratic Party, all those people with the dry erase boards. It actually advantages our folks. So we have to proximately defeat neo-fascism in 2020 and actually build the infrastructure. That's what the far right does. They build the infrastructure. And so what I'm doing is just one piece of infrastructure that we desperately need so that we have this countervailing force. Like, there's a revolutionary force on the right wing, and the political expression of that is the Republican Party, right? The Democratic Party is the political expression of getting Democrats elected. We need electoral vehicles that eventually could play the role that the ultra-right has electorally, and that's what I'm trying to do with the Working Families Party.
So, just if I can ask you, I want to build on this notion of who we're working with in the meantime, and how, and what some of the potential contradictions and possibilities are of that in the meantime.
Yeah.
But I definitely want to make sure we're talking about the long term too. And so I know you were involved with the She the People Candidates Forum, and I'm wondering if that opportunity offered some lessons about how to work in the meantime, how to push, how to, you know, who showed up, who didn't, and what did that mean when they showed up, how were they pressed, and so what are some of the kind of pragmatics of in the moment working with this Democratic establishment, which is largely, I think, who was being engaged at that point.
Sure. So 3-Point Strategies executed the She the People Women of Color Presidential Forum that happened April 24th. And we actually said yes 5 weeks before when there were no candidates who had been asked or who had said yes. And so there was a space that had been filled and no candidates had said yes. And so we were hired to essentially do what we do best, which is to be assassins. I always joke that I dress like an art teacher because I'm actually an assassin. And so, you know, people don't like to know you running up on them. And so essentially the reason that I said yes was because I wanted to actually get closer to the campaigns at that time. Honestly, like I just wanted the chance to see what they were like to work with, to see how they responded, to see how they worked with a small coalition of women of color organizations, base building organizations in Texas, etc. And it was a really interesting experience. I mean, I think that if anyone hasn't seen it, you can still go to shethepeople.org and watch it live, and watch it if it was live streamed. We actually did have 8 candidates, all the big ones. We didn't have much drama with people saying no. The thing that did happen, which was a week before the forum, 7 days before the forum, at the time, Vice President Biden hadn't been announced yet, and he announces, I'm going to have a big announcement on April 24th, and so I tweeted, actually 1,000 of me and my closest friends are already booked on April 24th, and then he said, actually, I'm going to do it April 25th, and so he did not obviously come because he hadn't been announced, but also didn't have his hand on the pulse to even know that literally 2,000 plus people, and not only did 5 million people watch She the People, but it had 100 million web impressions across the world. And so it was an experiment, I think, and really only the beginning of what I think is possible for the depth of conversations that can happen. But what I do want to do is just respond to this, like, what is our work? Because while She the People was something that I was proud to have executed, really I felt like that was just an additional way to get some questions answered and to lift the hood on how this election cycle will feel. But a few of the things that I'm really, really proud of is I'm actually just off of a plane from Cleveland, Ohio, where I spent the weekend training 150 progressive Black candidates and campaign staff all across the weekend. And actually it was the last in a series of 6 Black campaign schools that I've done this year. I've trained over 1,500 progressive Black candidates and staff in 2019. If you're interested, we're gonna in 2020 relaunch again, and it's called blackcampaignschool.org. And part of this is a tactic that I feel like Mo mentioned, and is that I do believe that as a person who wants to work on campaigns for a living, but more than that, want to elect the Ayanna Presleys and the Stacey Abrams of the world, is that it is actually our job and my assignment and my calling to actually get in front of the candidates we have now and the bench we have now and move them to the left. And so that actually is what I do in each of these rooms. I quietly actually train around a formula that most of our Democratic parties would never train on, about building base, not just talking to a specific type of voter, not in any way shirking your values, but needing a strategy in order to talk about the things that you want to talk to. So in Cleveland, Ohio this weekend, we had folks who were talking about how they wanted to run for mayor in small towns in Ohio because they want to bring down the police budget in their town. And we were strategizing and building campaign plans on exactly how to do that. And so that, for me, feels like an experiment that if we care about not only practicing democracy, but getting it to a place that we want, where we can have meaningful conversation about ideas, I think we also need to be willing to talk to folks who are raising their hands but don't have our shared politics. Additionally, the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project has a beautiful vision for 2020. You can actually go to ejp.m4bl.org. We've just launched our 2nd year campaign manager program, where we essentially hire 15 Black campaign managers to work full-time of an issue of their choice based on the community that they live in and an issue that they want to win. They receive $50,000 for 12 months. It goes directly to them as a full-time salary and are offered benefits as well. And they write their campaign plan with us, and then we support and coach them monthly in order to execute their campaign plan. So in 2018, we had a 15-person cohort. 12 of the 15 campaign managers not only won their races, but won ballot initiatives like banning the box on whether or not a formerly incarcerated person could get housing in New Orleans, are winning on really innovative ways to think about electoral work. And so I'm really proud of that. And we're going to continue to practice with governance by building a Black convention down the street from the Democratic Party convention next July in Wisconsin as a way to practice governance and demonstrate that we can actually have autonomous and self-determined spaces, but also to prepare for GOTV so that that Democratic nominee has to respond to Black people. And then third is 3-point strategies, and I would even say the heart of some of our work is working with those super bold Black women that I've been talking about. One race that I'm really excited about is Tammy Sawyer, who's running for mayor in Memphis, Tennessee. Anybody from Tennessee in here? Hey, Tennessee. And she is a young Black woman that I met in Black Campaign School 3 years ago. She's running on an alleviating poverty platform. She's running against an incumbent who is a registered Democrat, and actually all of the women that we've ever taken on are all running against Democrats in primaries. Our specialty really is primaries. And what's exciting about her is that she's an organizer. And so all of the folks who are now serving in her field mechanism and field arm are folks from Black Lives Matter Memphis, are folks who are from the community and saying like, actually, Tammy bailed me out of jail. So yeah, I'm gonna show up for her if she wants to be mayor. And so it's yet another example of, I think, what we can do when not only do we work with, support, and publicly uplift leaders who really love us, but also then show up for them so that they can lead and govern in the ways that we care about.
Judith, I wonder if you can tell us about the work that you've been doing. You know, we focused a lot on national elections. It's when we all get attuned to electoral politics as a country. But there's a lot going on down ballot. And there's some challenges and contradictions that happen in those spaces too. So I know that you've done work in Florida, but in other places as well. Tell us a bit about kind of what we should have in mind as we're thinking about electoral strategies. Do we have the capacity to go down ballot? You know, when we focus on local politics, what happens if it gets upturned, as someone spoke about on a panel yesterday, from the state level, right, where there may be control of the state level on the right, but we're trying to do something locally. You know, there's some really interesting DA races that are going on. Do we have the capacity to do that? And this, tell us more about kind of the up and down ballot strategies that we should be thinking about.
So,
and what lessons you can tell us about that have been learned.
Okay, so most of the organizations that we support are grassroots-based building organizations, and so they are very focused on the local. In fact, most of them aren't even thinking about this federal election. I mean, they're thinking about it, right? But it is not the focal point of the organizing, base building, turnout work that they will do. And in fact, I would say that in the past, or years gone by, we always worried about people voting down ballot. I actually think we now have got to start worrying about people voting up ballot because of the organizing work that has been done around prosecutors, for example. People are very engaged in prosecutorial races. It's from the George Zimmerman piece to Bob McCullough in St. Louis. People started to realize, that prosecutor has a hell of a lot of power, right? And so people are now ousting them. In Florida, we're an original member of the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition that started off years ago, probably like 2003, as a listserv, basically, of people who were just trying to figure out how to change the law in Florida. Florida at the time was one of 4 states that disenfranchised people for a lifetime if you'd been convicted of a felony. And you had to have the governor actually sign off on applications for clemency to get your rights restored. Of course, an old law that was passed during Reconstruction to get rid of the political power of Black folks. The same in Virginia. And so when Desmond Meade became the head of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, I remember being with him at a meeting in Florida. I think it was right after the 2012 election. When did Dream Defenders start? 2013. So it must have been like right around then. We were in a meeting, and Desmond got up in the meeting. This was like all these local groups in Florida and some donors, and he said, I think we need to do a ballot initiative around rights restoration. And everybody was like, what? Are you kidding? Do you know how much it costs? We just got done with fair districts. We can't do that. It costs at least $7 million. And where's that money going to go? And we have another election coming up, and money's got to go to candidates, and Hillary will be running one of these days, and we've got to pour money into her. And there were lots of reasons why this Black man shouldn't be talking about rights restoration. And I remember standing up in the room being like, well, he's right. For those of you who needed the polling numbers, because that's what some people need to get over. The polling numbers show that 69% of the voters would support that. And, years later, fast forward, Desmond and his crew, right? Even before some other big hitters came in to help put money in, they were doing petitions on the back of their cars. His wife, the kids, his mother-in-law, his name's Big Mama. Big Mama was doing it on the back of her car, and making it real for people. And then it was like, all of a sudden, folks started to, they're actually getting signatures. Oh, crap, they're really doing this. Maybe we should get on board with this. Oh, let's put some money in. Let's actually take it over. Let's try to take it over. So all of that happening. And here's a black man who's a person with a felony conviction, who has been to law school after he got out, right? And he's running this thing. And so it passes in November. Incredible moment, right? And what folks don't know is that part of and this is part of the work that we did with them, was that it wasn't just about the ballot initiative. We were also building out chapters of Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, so that there would be people who could then be registered, and then they could become a voting bloc on criminal justice issues, right? And so there are chapters around the state, and then the legislature does what the legislature does. And there's a long story behind that, but actually, Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, so that folks know, do not call it a poll tax. What the legislature did, it's a very long story, but the language of the ballot initiative actually anticipated that people would have to pay fines, fees, and restitution, for those who don't know. And so what the legislature did actually gives some ways for some relief around it, which allows for people to go into court, and this is what the work is now, is like people going into court to get their sentences modified, to get rid of their fines and fees. And so that is happening, right? But then the Florida legislature also is like, after they do that, they come in and they're like, let's change the rules around ballot initiatives. In Florida, if there's 60%, right, it passed with 65%. Louisiana, where they got the unanimous jury ballot initiative passed, they got 65% too. So a lot of states are starting to see like, oh crap, people are participating in our democracy. They're voting for these damn ballot initiatives. We've been doing these ballot initiatives for a long time. Now they're doing it. And they're winning. Oh no, now let's change the rules, right? Because they're actually winning some stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the work moving forward, right, is first of all, and I want to add another thing, because the other piece that we're seeing is that for the work that happens on the ground, where people are doing those down ballot things, we can get people elected, but then what's happening is at the state level, they are nullifying everything, right? And so for them, the win is to concentrate power at a higher level, and then to figure out like, okay, if we win at the state level and then we win redistricting, it's game over, right? For years, decades to come. And so I think that the folks on the ground get the calculation. I think what it also means is that the work that we're doing, so we actually support folks who know Kayla Reed and the Close the Workhouse campaign. We're going to close the jail in St. Louis, I promise you. And those folks are, understand that like it's the local stuff that will get our people to the voting booth, and they're going to fight these fights, and that this is the way that we're going to win, and that we have to figure out for our people, what is the entry point? Everybody's going to have a different entry point, whether it's the school board, it's the prosecutor, it's the judges' races, it's the sheriff's races, that every entry point we can use, we need to use. And I think that's the beauty of what is happening on the ground around organizing, is that people are tapping into all of those issues and using those levers.
And can I?
Sure, absolutely.
Y'all were gonna clap, you can clap. Yeah, because I just wanted to say what that was bringing up for me is not just that we have to use them, but that actually what people say are the most important thing on the ballot may not be that for the folks who we need to inspire. And I think what we did in 2016 is care so much about the presidential, and I just think historically in this country, because it's like when people actually vote and their resources put to voting. But what we have, I think, since learned is all of the ways that we can dream about other shit when we're not inspired by the top of the ticket. And what that actually does, though, and I think an argument for why so many of us should be investing our time, people, money, resources in things that are down ballot, is it lifts the votes for when we don't have an inspiring candidate in other places or that we don't feel motivated. And so we actually have to invest and organize in this way because it gets our people out. More people in 2016 and 2017 were voting for progressive DAs than they were for the president in some of our communities. There were 13 progressive DAs who were elected, and in all of those places, more people voted for them than they did for Hillary Clinton. And it's not to say that I think that that's necessarily okay, but I actually think that's a lesson that when you can inspire people and make your vision plain, that people will come out and they'll choose you, and that we need to be doing that in really sweeping ways.
Can I want to add one other thing. I think the other thing is that I want to get back to movement for Black Lives because I love y'all. But I think so many of these issues that people are now engaging with and voting on are things that come, in love and in our need to have repair and healing, right, around Trayvon, around Mike Browne. There's just like this, our community gets it, right? I mean, it's not like people, they're like, understand, not only gets it, but understand that there's some shit that we can do. And while, I want to, put aside the police, because I still think we haven't done anything about them, that there are these other people who are really, have so much power in this system that cages us, that we are going to undo that. And so one of the things, we did a poll of 18 to 24-year-olds in 2018, and wanted to do them because March for Our Lives had just happened, and we're like, okay, well, what's going to motivate young folks? And we did Black, Native American, Asian, and Latino. And across the board, racial justice was their number one issue that they cared about. And across the board, the thing that motivated them was police brutality. For Asian, 18 to 20, but that's because they're the generation that maybe their parent took them to their first rally when Trayvon was killed, right? And they came into political consciousness watching Ferguson. And watching people in the streets, not only in Ferguson, but in New York and other places. And so it resonates with them that actually this is the thing that matters to me, and I'm going to show up because I want to change that.
So I want to ask a question about accountability. And Mo, you started out by talking about standing on that table and doing the helicopter with around Obama.
I remember that.
And so what we're also seeing through Jessica's work and those of others that it's possible to get candidates who have been kind of brought up through movement into office. And I worry about us not having real strong accountability muscles once they're there. And how do we hold our friends, our people, our folks accountable when the systems to which they are entering are going to offer all sorts of alternative incentives?
Great. All right, so it's a really great question. One I've given some thought on. So two things, right? I think some of the ways that we've been thinking about accountability and how we, there's structural reasons why people show up certain ways. So it's helpful when I think about structurally, like what's actually happening. And I'll give a few examples to explain what I'm talking about. I remember when AOC first got elected, everybody was like exuberant, right? And in some ways, I feel like she is a really remarkable figure in our current politics, and her ability, no, it's not soul, like she has a team and everything, but her ability to pretty regularly be able to show up publicly in ways that are not normative for most elected officials, and like push the Overton window so that we can have different conversations. Like, it's been really. But I remember, like, she was asked a question about the occupation in Palestine, and she said something that was not like. She said something either vague or it wasn't like, it was impolitic in some ways, and like immediately people were like, she's trash. Like, we need to like. It was like, you know, it was like very sudden, and like it was done. It was a wrap, right? And you know, in general, I think that we have to figure out what we're doing. Like, is this a fraternity, right? Or are we building a mass movement? Are we hazing people, or are we organizing people, right? And so, people, because we're human, it's the nature of the human condition. Like, I didn't set up these rules, are imperfect, right? I am. All our politicians are, whatever. So people will do all types of things. Number one. Number two, everybody could elect me to whatever office. I'm going to be subject to the conditions. Like, if I'm a legislator, I'm going to be subject to the conditions in that body, right? Yep. Let's say we elect me as like a left Democrat, then I'm going to be subject to my caucus and the realities of my caucus. And if there isn't any countervailing force so that I can align with something else, naturally over time, I'm going to veer closer and closer to, I will be disciplined into veering closer and closer to what the caucus demands of me. And so that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is like, the culture of American politics is like, it's very entrepreneurial, it's very American. It's very much about like an individual's personal career aspirations. It's like, you know what? I woke up and I think I'm ready. Jessica, I'm gonna run, right? And that's usually how these things happen. And then I build Moland, right? And I'm in control of it. I'm the CEO of Moland. And then I interact with movement. Right? Versus what I'm attempting to do with the party is like, I want to flip it, right? Because then, okay, I decide I want to run. Then I need to figure out like, all right, I want to run, right? I feel I'm progressive, and generally the two things you need to have is you need to, as a politician, and I've met many, and most of them are like suboptimal in many ways, right? But you need to be ambitious, and you need to want to see your name on stuff, right? And everything else is gravy, right? And so generally when people decide they want to run, they don't have a platform. They don't necessarily have an intervention they're trying to make, right? Usually they're like, all right, well, I need to win. So what are people into? Okay, well, I'll support this thing here, and like, what's poll on healthcare? Like, literally, right? And then they try to get a majority around this issue agenda that they hastily put together that's based on how closely they think they can get to 50% plus one, right? So that they can get a majority of votes. We want to flip that. So we start off by building mass movements that have a platform, like the amazing work that many people in this room, including Tangerine McHarris and others, led, developing the Vision for Black Lives platform, for example. So it's like we have a mass movement that has a platform. And through that platform, we could develop an issue agenda and an electoral platform. Then, under those conditions, we could recruit people to be the standard bearers of that platform who are deeply aligned to the movement, right? So it's totally switching the trajectory. So it's not about like, I woke up and I feel it, guys, let's go. Or like Beto, it's like, I'm born for this, or whatever it is, right? And so what we're experimenting with is what happens when you flip it, right? And so we're sending people in order to execute the platform. But the other thing is that when they are in those positions, because we started with movement, they come in with that movement. So they feel like, listen, I don't need, when the Democratic Party chair calls, it goes to voicemail. When Jessica calls, I pick up, right? And the reason I pick up is because I came in with hundreds of volunteers who represent thousands of other people that are aligned with this vision, and they're gonna flank me. So it's not just about accountability, it's about the carrot and stick. They're gonna flank me and support me when I stand up and I'm like, I'm a decarceral candidate, and this is what it means, right? I actually don't fundamentally believe in this economic system, so I'm gonna have a very different conversation about our small business strategy. I'm gonna and I could do it, and I feel confidence because I know I have these folks behind me. I talk to all types of people, including people who are super radical, right? But they're like, yes, I am, and I need to stay elected, and I don't have anybody to flank me, right? And this is why we're experimenting movement first, not the great aspirations of a great progressive who's going to do good, right? And my hope is through experimenting with that, that's what political parties do. Political parties are disciplinary units, if you will. They're able to, because they have enough power, make sure that their members, the people that they get elected, do advance the ideological objectives of the party. The problem is we have a non-ideological party in the Democrats, right? And so I think it's going to be a lot of experimentation, but what we can't do is elect our friends and then throw them into conditions that themselves, even with the best ideological intentions, do not have the power to stave off things that are structural. So we have to have a structural analysis and not like a individual interpersonal analysis around this, right? It's like, you're a bad person. It's like, no, we haven't set the conditions for our people to do the work that they must do when we get them elected.
Judith, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, and not only do we not change the conditions, but they're not the end all be all. No. And so one, I think, example of this that for me is very motivating, but also I think can be duplicated is the way in which Jackson, Mississippi is experimenting with co-governance. I have the honor of working with Rukia Lumumba on the Electoral Justice Project, and she was the campaign manager for her brother, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, who's now the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. And as they were running not only directly in partnership with movement, but also on a platform of co-governance. That not only would they write the city's budget together if he was elected, but that they would build out the strategic plan of the city together if he was elected. And so when he was elected, they enacted a set of people's assemblies for any constituent, did not have to be in movement, and in fact, I had the opportunity to go to one, and it felt very, very different than I expected. Like really, really, really different. So not only was the mayor in no way facilitating it, he was just a person in jeans, like sitting in movement, or sitting in, the chairs, eating egg salad sandwiches with all the rest of us. Mm-hmm. The police officers in plain clothes were there too as constituents. Everyone from across that neighborhood were there, and they broke us up into issues that were kind of popping for folks in the community, and then we had to discuss and then not only report back on our dialogue, but make a recommendation for how the city might engage with that particular problem. Well, I was in the domestic violence group, and there had been this rise, or at least the numbers were changing around domestic violence in the city and in that particular neighborhood. It was totally different than I expected. I came in with a particular worldview and a personal experience, but the way that people wanted the government to engage in that issue was totally different than my theoretical brain got to. There were people there who had been victims of domestic violence who were saying, I actually do not want in any way for the government to get engaged in this. This is what I think. I think we should create a community organization that does this thing. Then there were other people who were engaging with each other and talking about how no, this is a police issue. The police should immediately arrest someone who's been accused of domestic violence. And for me, this was a really helpful thing. That as much as I have help to write public policy for governance and all of that, that actually the practice of governance is way different. And for those of us who are like, governing our homes or in community where you're always, as much as we love the movement for Black Lives, if you are in the governing body of the movement for Black Lives, it is very frustrating because you're actually practicing governance with each other. And you have to make decisions and you have to do things for the most and best good, even if it doesn't directly affect you. And I really think that this is an important thing that I hope we all get to experience and practice with more. And I think it meets some of these accountability measures because it's not just about a benevolent leader who knows who their base is. It's actually about a base that's written the strategic plan and has to be accountable to each other to get the plan right. And I think we only have a few places in this country that are moving in that direction, but I absolutely think that it's a really important thing. And then I just want to say one quick thing, and I think this could connect to a voter suppression question and if we get there, but an example based on what Mo was talking about around base, we really cared about this on the Stacey Abrams campaign, and we're feeling the energy of the fact that we had captured the base in Georgia, and that allowed her to be unapologetic about some things. It allowed her to talk about ending cash bail in Georgia. It allowed her to talk openly about her brother who's currently incarcerated, etc. When we were planning for the end of the election, what we did is about 3 months in advance, and we knew there was going to be an incredible amount of voter suppression, that there were beautiful coalitions of folks working across the state to ensure that this didn't happen. But we were campaigning, so we knew that we were either going to be declared the victor or not. That's what we thought. Well, so we created a scenario planning document. Scenario A, if he wins, scenario B, if she wins, etc. Scenario Z, and I'm not lying to you in any way, Scenario Z was if there was complete and utter election fuckery, and it actually said that. This is what happens when I'm your campaign manager. And it was, each one of the scenarios was a directive for how we all would act in that scenario. And in that scenario, it said, underneath, non-concession, move our entire operation into a voter protection operation. Every single field organizer becomes now a voter protection operation. Every lawyer that has ever worked for us is flown into the state to become a voter protection operation. So it said that. We never thought we'd get there, seriously. Because we built some good shit. We thought we would at least have first 3. Well, so when we hand Stacey the paper and we say, we're in scenario Z, she pulls out the scenario Z remarks, and in the next 2 minutes walks on stage and says, I'm not conceding. We're gonna keep going. And the reason was because she knew who she returned to. She knew that everybody wanted her to keep good on the promise that she said, which is that she would protect every vote. She said that every day on the trail. So if we would have conceded, it would have been a betrayal to our base. And knowing that and feeling so confident about it, we never blinked. There was not a blink in that room about what she needed to do. She immediately moved into the scenario plan because she knew that we were all waiting for her to do that. And what that then did was to trigger elections across the country to not concede and to count every vote. And for me, that is also an example of how you demonstrate accountability to people, not by doing the easy thing or the politically good thing, but the thing that your base wants you to do.
Yes.
I want to ask one more question about voter suppression, and I want to turn to the audience. I do want to turn to the audience for questions. And I'm wondering about how, as the public became more and more attuned to how voter suppression was rolling out, did that become a mobilization tool and a strategy that, it's not the one we would choose, but how effective is broad-based understanding and knowledge about voter suppression as a way to get folks who, I wasn't going to necessarily use it, but you're sure not going to take it away from me.
That's right.
Is that effective? Is it not? Did that play out? Are people able to use that as a strategy?
You should talk about Georgia, but I can tell you that, so for years, our funders had told us that we should not talk about voter suppression too much because it would scare off voters. And I was all like, I'm black, you're not, and there's something that I know about my people. And they're not screwed. And so like, just like the idea that people would like shrink away from that is wrong. And folks do get fired. I think Georgia was a good example of how people were like, oh no, you're not ripping us off. And I think that we too often want to take the easy way out when people want to engage in the fight. Now I will say the one bad thing about voter suppression is that people forget about it 4 days after the election.
Yeah.
And as an organization that we launched this like campaign for a national right to vote, to get a constitutional amendment, because you don't have a right to vote in this country. It's not in the Constitution, you don't have one. And we found how hard it was to get people to embrace voting as an issue, right? And that people just move on. And even in Georgia, so what's happened in the past few months is that Marcia Fudge, Congresswoman Marcia Fudge, has had these hearings around the country around voter suppression. And they've been trying to do this in order to boost the record to actually restore the Voting Rights Act. And those hearings, I'll put those hearings aside, but one thing that we found, because they have mostly experts. So what we tried to do in particular states like Georgia, North Dakota, and some others, Florida, was to have people's hearings, because we knew the congressional ones were not going to include people who actually had gotten their votes stolen, right? So we did people hearings, and I will tell you that it was hard to get people to turn out and talk about that, because that was done, right? Now they might remember it when the next election comes, but the in-between, when we're trying to fix some stuff and we're trying to actually get an expansion of voting rights, it's very difficult to get people engaged around these issues. But they will, once you remind them, be ready to mobilize.
Thank you all. So I want to turn to the audience, and maybe we can have a number of questions come up, and then you all can take them at your choice. I'm hoping somebody will ask about third parties, but no pressure.
Let's just ask it.
Thank you. I have a question around expanding the electorate. And Judy, I think maybe this question is for you. I was hoping you might raise up when Regina asked about down ballot races, the notion of where are the opportunities to actually expand the electorate, and it made me think about the report that you all did in Florida around what restoring rights could mean for local elections because of the potential impact of folks that were going back to their communities.
Thanks for that softball question, my friends. So I paid her with a lobster roll. So we did a report called, actually it's funny, it was called Democracy Disappeared Before the Election, and then we republished it, called Democracy Rising after Amendment 4 passed, same report. But what we did was we mapped the population of people with felony convictions in the state of Florida in 10 counties to where they would be returning to. And then we overlaid it with all kinds of economic data. So poverty, child poverty rates, unemployment rates, and of course it's, all the things that you would think, right? It's like we have concentrations of people where they're living, all of those bad indicators for their communities, with the idea that if they had their rights restored and had political power, then they could actually shift some things by holding elected officials accountable. And so I do think that in places like Florida, there are incredible concentrations of communities that are, first of all, not registered, those who could register without the felony convictions. Then we've got people with felony convictions that also could be registered. For us, we are doing more work around rights restoration. So Virginia, where we've been doing work around rights restoration since 2003, and we were pushing on each of the governors, because it's another one of those states where it's the governor has to do it.
we were finally, we would give them these legal memos